handing over to Matt, to you and Adriaan, heartily word of welcome. Thank you for sharing with us. We're looking forward with the learnings that you're going to share with us.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. And thank you, Adriaan, for sharing the screen. Today, I'm happy to share some of the experiences that we have here in Australia, and I echo the comments. Australia was in a market, we had in a very similar position to South Africa in 1998 when we incorporated a large market and went to a wholesale market system, as anticipated in the previous presentation. So today, I'd like to give you a snapshot as to how the Australian experience it may be useful for the South African, for the challenges you have ahead. We'll cover the general comparison between the two. We'll cover the legal framework incorporated into the Australian energy sector, how lawmakers have achieved the objectives originally set out, how those objectives have changed over time. And then I'd like to focus on some of the most recent market developments, issues and learnings that we have taken from our experience and how we're changing our market here to deal with similar challenges that are confronting the South African market. To give a little bit of background, and I think this gives good context, the grey shaded area on the map of Australia on the right-hand side of the screen, that is South Africa. That is the size of, to give you a comparison, the national electricity market in Australia, and if you can see my mouse on screen, the national electricity market in Australia, which is an integrated market, covers the area from South Australia through all the way down, up and down the east coast, all the way up to the top of Queensland, and all the way down to Tasmania in the south, the island in the south. Approximately 2.5 times the size of South Africa. Very similar amounts of installed capacity. In Australia, though, we have an unbundled generation, transmission and distribution system with retailers selling electricity to customers. The East Grid, the national electricity market, is about 80% of the electricity market in Australia. We have competition between generators. There's a wholesale market cleared by the regulator called the Australian Energy, the AMEU, Australian Energy Market Operator. We have, so I'm just working through the slide. The electricity is traded through the wholesale market and it's cleared every week. So it's cleared on a 5-minute basis and cleared every week with buyers and sellers clearing through the market. There's a secondary derivative market on that basis. That market operates on the stock exchange, and that is buying and selling of electricity on a forward basis. These are some of the differences. Some of the similarities, though, are that it is a coal-dominated market, coal-fired power station generation market, together with large coal exports. But perhaps more relevant over the last 5 to 10 years has been that we share very similar natural resources, being wind and solar irradiance. Some rough statistics: 65% coal-dominated market, with another 7 to 10% of gas. A growing proportion of wind, now over 10%. A deep and growing solar market. We split it out in Australia between grid scale, the utility scale, grid connected, which is anything over 5 megawatts in size, and distributed, which is rooftop. In our distribution market, the distributed solar market here is both on rooftops of mums and dads of retail customers, as well as larger consumers, the corporate and industrial market, which is on top of factories and other large installations. We have a small but growing very quickly BESS market, in a battery energy storage system, which is standalone large batteries of hundreds of megawatts, if not more, which are purely an arbitrage play. They charge and discharge off. They charge off the grid and discharge back into the grid, and a very small biomass biomass capability. The map at the bottom is also very interesting to show you the voltage of the network. You can see it's East Coast dominated, and you can see that the high voltage, which is the 500 and the 400 kV, predominates up and down the East Coast. That is a product of where the market was in 1998 and how it evolved over time, where the coal-fired generators are located across up and down that backbone. That is also where most of the population is based. Just to give you some comparative stats, and Adriaan can chime in here, but we have over 500 market generators, so they are independent power producers. We have a wholesale market that was implemented in 1998. The NEM, the National Electricity Market, is an enormous, long, skinny network. Transmission and distribution of electricity in Australia is the largest challenge. And we're seeing that challenge now as we move to a more distributed energy resource system, away from centralised coal-fired generation. It is a large market, 11.5 billion Australian dollars, which I think you multiply by 10 to get to Rand. The 11 odd million customers sitting across the NEM, with 65 gigawatts of generation. The largest generator in the NEM is approximately 2 gigawatts, but we have a deep distribution of other smaller generators. Can't have lawyers on a webinar without talking about the law. Australia is a unique place in this regard. It shares some similarities with America in that we are a federation of states. So very, very simply, the right of the Crown or the independence sits with the states, and each of the states on the Australian, so Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia, Western Australia, are the foundation states of Australia, and they cede power to the federal government. What that means is the federal government does not have any powers in relation to electricity regulation. The states have come together. They came together in 1998, 99 and 2000 to form the National Electricity Market. What that means is it is a cooperation across these states. They are interconnected, and generation from, for example, Queensland, it often flows south to New South Wales. Electricity from Victoria often flows north into New South Wales, and from Tasmania north as well. We are in the process of building significant additional transmission capacity and much deeper interconnection between the states to move that energy around. Western Australia on the left-hand side is a separate market. It is a case example in itself. Just to give you most of the population in Western Australia is in the bottom southern southwest corner. Over 60% of the electricity generated in Western Australia is consumed outside of that network and is consumed on microgrids or just generally behind the meter. That's important because it sets the frame for the legal framework. So I'm interested in the comments earlier about how a network can evolve, so how a system can evolve. Australia went through a process of privatisation of its generation, transmission, and retail businesses. You can see on the screen, and this covers gas as well, because the gas network in Australia is also deregulated. But you can see that these are the participants at a transmission, at a generation, and at a retail level. The color coding there, we'll call it lime green, colored dots, they are private enterprises, 100% private enterprises. There remain some public entities. They are mostly in the transmission network and the distribution network. And they are distributors of energy in the sense that they're not retailers. They run the distribution network. You can see that there are a lot of participants. And perhaps this to give you a feel about how our market has evolved over the last, well, over the last 10 years, but over the last 5 really. You can see that on average, between 2015-16 and 2020-21, the proportion of network charge on someone's bill on an annual basis has reduced by 4%. And what has grown is the spot price, the electricity charge, the megawatt hour charge. What has not really moved is the environmental part of the cost, although we don't anticipate that to move significantly. However, what is interesting is this hasn't moved over this period, but the growth in renewable energy generation has been exponential. We've seen a doubling year on year of wind and solar over this period. I might throw to Adriaan to give us an update, or give us the broader regulatory framework implemented.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Hello, everyone. So, as said earlier, lawyers like to talk about the law, so let's give you a bit of a framework on how things work in Australia. We're going to start on the right hand with the right-hand picture here. So first, we have the Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO. That is basically the system operator sitting at Simmerpan, in South Africa equivalent. The only difference here is, of course, that it's not the same in South Africa with a single buyer Eskom. This is the market operator that administers the electricity wholesale market into which generators sell and retailers can then buy from and distribute to their customers. Also important here is 4 years ago, I remember, or 5 years ago, we were very excited when the first retail license or trading license was given to a IPP in South Africa. In Australia, that works a little bit differently. There's about 58 different retailers here, all competing against each other to provide best services to the client. That's a great example of the slide we saw earlier on how there's a shift from an asset focus. Matt will touch on a little bit later about the recent market suspension we had in Australia and how that worked, and whether that was in fact a market failure or actually the regulations working well. Then here in the middle, we have the Australian Energy Regulator. That is our equivalent of NERSA. That they're responsible for economic regulation and rules and compliance. They also set tariffs for distribution and transmission. So when NERSA in South Africa sets prices as well, that is not the same for the AER, because prices are determined through a market. And then on the left-hand side, we have the Australian Energy Market Commission, and that is the commission that makes the rules of the energy market, or the national energy market, we call it the NEM. Now, the reason this is important is in South Africa, the energy legislation is promulgated by Parliament. But in Australia, because of the federal system that Matt explained, there's no ability for the Central Federal Parliament to make rules to regulate the market. Those rules need to be made in some other type of way. And the best way to think about this is the SAP, the South African Power Pool Memorandum of Incorporation, or Memorandum of Understanding, that agreement that organizes how the states and SAP trade. That's basically the same thing that the Australian Energy Market Commission administers. So in this one, you see here on the left-hand side, the Australian Energy Market Agreement. So that agreement was entered into between the states of Australia, the states and territories, and that sets out certain understandings on how they think the market will be run. Now, what's difficult about this, if you think it's difficult to amend the Electricity Regulation Act, just remember that there's just one parliament. In this case, there's 5 states that need to agree to the changes that need to go into energy legislation in Australia. And the way that is done is there's an act promulgated in South Australia, and that is called the National Electricity South Australia Act. And as part of that act, there's an annexure, which is the National Electricity Law. And under that law, certain rules are made. Now, the Australian, this entity here, the Australian Energy Market Commission, is the entity that can amend these rules, and those rules deal with market registration, the spot market, connection, network regulation, metering, and then very importantly, these rules need to adhere to Australia's national electricity objective. Now that objective is very much the same as when you look at the Energy Act or the energy regulation objectives. Why do we have this legislation? What must it always adhere to? And in Australia, that up to 5 days ago was price, quality, safety, reliability, and security of supply. 5 days ago, Australia decided to, at long last, add environmental goals to that. So Australia was a little bit behind in that regard. It was included in our legislation previously, and then it was taken out a couple of years ago due to political pressure, all to do with or large part to do with the coal and gas resources the country has. Matt, I see you took your microphone off. Do you want to add something there?
No, just to add that despite that not being part of the National Electricity Objective, the states of Australia further promoted renewable energy despite the federal government's hesitation to, by supporting renewable energy through feed-in tariffs and power purchase agreements, as well as other incentives, particularly rooftop incentives, and providing a feed-in tariff to support rooftop installation.
And to add to that, what was then very interesting in the recent national election in Australia, the public supported the party that had the greenest policies in the end, or the party that leaned more to the green side, which is also, it's interesting when you compare it to South Africa and Australia. All voters must vote. It's a constitutional obligation. You must vote, otherwise you get fined. So it's interesting that the people in the end drove the decision to have a greener economy. Now, this National Electricity South Australia Act, or the National Energy Law, the NEL, and the NER then gets implemented by separate states. The example that we have here is how it works in Queensland. So Queensland implements it, but then they can apply and vary the National Energy Law and the National Energy Rules within certain parameters. So again, it becomes difficult, some different rules in the same market. And that's also a big part where the competition between states come in. Obviously, if you can create a situation in your state or in your municipality to apply to South Africa, where you can generate cheaper power, more reliable power, that is something that you can export to the state next door, and there's some money to be made. Then every state has their own electricity act, under which they determine licensing and land access. So that would be this equivalent of the electricity regulation in South Africa. And then electrical safety, for instance, get regulated separately and per state. And then, of course, the Australian electricity retail legislation works basically on the same format as this. Now, this slide we thought was important to mention to you, because often we say that we need policy intervention, or we need legislation to change, but what do we actually mean when we say that? What we're trying to explain here is that lawmakers have certain levers that they can pull in an energy market to get where they want to be. Now, the first one of that is ownership. Referring back to that slide that Matt shared previously, that showed the private and the mixed ownership models. The state can either own your distribution business, it can be privately owned, it can be hybrid owned. In Australia, we had great examples of that, where, for instance, New South Wales sold its transmission entity called Transgrid. The reason why they sold Transgrid, or sold 50% of it, I think it was, Matt, was they needed capital to undertake other government projects. So in New South Wales, there was a great need for road building, bridges and tunnels, and the money from selling Transgrid was used to finance that. We'll talk a bit later about the issues that came with that privatization. Another lever is to decide on fuel source. So obviously in Australia, we had a long-standing debate on, well, we have all this coal, we should burn it. But because of societal international pressure, that is being stepped back. We are now seeing a situation where large amounts of coal generation is being withdrawn. It feels almost like on a daily basis we get new announcements of more coal power stations closing down. And coal power stations, of course, have no chance almost of development in the country, also because most banks won't finance that anymore. So also renewables, obviously, which is a great lever. South Africa is an example of that. In 2012, when the IPP program was introduced, created a great bit of investment and sent the market in a certain direction. And then also, of course, classification of fuel. And we'll talk more about hydrogen later, but what is green hydrogen? When is your energy actually renewable? And how countries, by implementing policy and regulations, can decide how that should be determined to also give a certain market signal. And market structures, so your market can either be state-based and controlled, or it could be a pool system. Industry structure, we spoke about that earlier, the separation between sectors, for instance, Eskom transmission, Eskom generation, vertical integration, a centrally planned system or a free market. Of course, South Africa is a great example of the integrated resource plan, or the IRP, where there is a central plan to develop the market from. It's just be regularly updated and then it can be used. In Australia, that's of course an issue because there's no central rulemaking authority. In that sense, we do have something here called the ISP, or the Integrated System Plan, which deals with transmission and mainly with transmission planning. The problem with that is, though, because the states are in competition with each other, nobody is really incentivized to listen to this plan because they can probably make more money in other places. And while we're saying this and while we're talking about states that can have competition between each other, also think about that in a municipality context and realize that your municipal entity can potentially compete not only with other generators, other distributors, but also with each other. Then tariff structures, they can either be centrally fixed, market-driven, or regulator determined. Now, we're going to take you to a couple of interesting points or learnings that we think are important from our market. So we're going to talk about some developments, some issues and learnings. So the first one, there's the regulatory environment. We also already spoke about the fact that we have no central energy policy, but again, that didn't, as Matt said, that wasn't to the detriment of renewable energy, for instance, in South Africa, because states drove that mandate themselves because it made financial sense. Then we are seeing various rule changes in our market. I read somewhere the other day that, and I don't know if you can remember, but the number of changes to the rules since they were implemented, the version of the rules we are on.
We're up to version 196. So that's an update to the rules. Now those updates can be minor, but we are up to 196. What's interesting is that the speed of rule change, or the number of rule changes, has increased exponentially. So, for example, I think 5 years ago we were up to version 120. So we've doubled our change, and that's a great. Look, it can be challenging as the rules change, but it shows that what is important is those rules are being driven by the regulator, by the AER and the AMEC. And AMEC is an open system. Anyone can propose a rule change. That rule change is essentially put to the market participants, and a market participant is both the generator, the transmission business, and the retailers. And transmission is both distribution and transmission, and commented on, and fundamentally approved by the market itself. There's no political involvement in those rule changes. What is particularly relevant in this market is the growth in renewable energy, and that has grown from originally being very expensive and being promoted by the states, and subsidized by the states because of a political agenda, to now where the cheapest form of new generation, the cheapest form of a new megawatt is in renewables. It's either in wind or in solar. And what we're seeing in this market at the moment is the cost of energy storage coming down substantially, from north of 800 Australian dollars a megawatt hour to coming down to below $150 a megawatt hour to generate. That's the capex cost. So what's that? What has driven that? Two things have driven that. Fundamentally, economies of scale. Equipment has become cheaper. But similarly, rule changes have been proposed and adopted such that it becomes a much more viable business case to build and own and operate on an arbitrage basis batteries. What is particularly relevant in your context as you look forward to how to evolve your market in the market in South Africa is to keep one eye firmly fixed on cost of technology, or the reduction in technology cost. Solar in Australia is now very cheap, and that is driven by international supply chain and a growth in the market, in the expertise on the ground to build these projects. South Africa has the benefit of those learnings and that knowledge to build new generation. So that is the way that Australia will meet the significant expansion in electricity demand that we anticipate to see over the next 30 years. We will need to build a huge amount of transmission to move that energy around. The Australian market, the NEM, was a hub and spoke market, meaning large coal-fired generators sitting on large capacity transmission to distribute energy to homes, fundamentally, a one-way market, a one-way street. We are now moving, and it is difficult and it is challenging, but we are now moving to a distributed energy system where energy is generated in lots of different places at remote parts of the grid and moved across the grid, not in a hub. And so that requires it's a two-way grid. Energy is moving both back and forth at all times across the network. But more importantly, it requires a much more interconnected network, not a hub and spoke, but a web where energy is moved not through central corridors, but across the network. I think we've covered off those pieces. But the other thing to note is that distributed energy system is exactly what we have in some parts of Australia for a long time, which is the remote and microgrid application. What becomes interesting in this market, and this is happening in real time, is do you need transmission to distribute energy to the end of a long skinny line, or do you simply take that town or region off the network and create a microgrid with renewables, potentially wind and potentially most relevantly solar, with a battery, and potentially even hydrogen backup, hydrogen energy storage backup. What is interesting also in this market is a huge groundswell of popular support for renewables and against coal-fired power stations. As Adriaan has alluded to, it is near impossible. Well, it won't happen in Australia. No new fired coal power stations will be built in Australia unless the government underwrites them. That is because banks won't finance them because they won't be seen to be financing new coal, and also equity won't invest because there is not a long-term future for it. That has caused a significant problem in this market, which is the coal-fired power stations have got too old and are now unreliable. They are not baseload. But that problem has actually created the opportunity for energy storage, because energy storage, but large batteries, whether that's pumped hydro or otherwise, is going to fill that market. And that's the 14 gigawatts of power to come out by the end of this decade. I realize we're coming up on time. Adriaan, do you want to run us quickly through probably one of the most interesting ones, which is the market suspension here in Australia?
Yes. So the other day there was a comment made in one of the sessions that yes, Australia has a market, but the market was suspended. What happened there? It's a little bit more complicated than that. It's true, the market got suspended. That meant that the retailers were given a specific price at which they were allowed to sell their electricity. The generators got a specific amount of payment. The retailers were allowed to sell the electricity at a certain price. And the reason why that happens is to ensure that the lights don't go off. So interesting, yes, there was a market suspension, a free trading and a free determination of price in the market to a government set level, but the lights didn't go off. So even though trading was suspended, the market wasn't suspended, which is actually been a great example of how a free market can still operate if it's underpinned by the necessary regulation. Mathis, you want to add something there?
Just to say that the reason for the intervention and the suspension of market pricing was because too much coal had come out of the market and there was no guarantee of supply. So that the buffer between supply and demand anticipated or forecast by the market operator was so narrow that they said, no, we're going to take back the market and we are going to direct generation. And that is a power that's only been exercised once. It was exercised for 6 days. The market is now back at a wholesale market price. But it's always been in the legislation. It's always been in the rules. It's been in the rules for 30 years. So the first time it was exercised, and that is the crisis we have in this country. And it is a crisis that is born from lack of policy at a federal level for over 10 years. But that is the opportunity we have, and it's the opportunity we're seeing right now. And I can tell you that we are very busy helping clients build very large energy storage projects, whether they are pumped hydro or, let's just call it, chemical batteries, lithium, flow, air liquid, others.
Then let's just quickly finish the last point. So seeing that we're moving to a grid more renewable energy in Australia, we've moved past this worry that you won't have a strong grid when you have renewable energy on it. There's a lot of work that's been done on inverters and the grid strengthening properties or grid forming properties that those can have. The AMEU, the market operator, is also investing a lot in that, so we don't see that as an issue anymore. That being said, the market is definitely no longer fit for purpose. It was designed for coal-fired power stations, which is not what we have now. We, as Matt explained earlier, the question is, do we still build a power station at the one side of the grid delivering energy to a house, or should we move to a more distributed model? Electric vehicles or EVs they're going to be a big thing in Australia. It still remains to be seen how they're going to change our usage patterns. The issue, of course, is you plug your EV in at your house, you charge it there on the grid, then you drive to work, probably in another municipality or another area, and you plug it in there again. Whether that EV charges back into the grid or taps more energy there, it will be interesting to see how that pans out. There's a lot of regulation in Australia still to be made to sort that. Of course, the same can be said around the world, but load used to follow demand, and now we have a situation where we can switch our demand around so that it can follow load. Transmission, long thin grid we have in Australia. Big issue that we have here is with privatization. A lot of these entities or transmission companies and distribution companies aren't incentivized to expand networks. They have we call it the regulatory investment test for transmission. It's very much the same as the NYPD awards in South Africa. If you were in any way inefficient in doing your job, you will not be able to claw back costs. And for that specific reason, privatized entities in Australia do not want to expand the grid. And it's a huge problem. And that's the reason why we now need to build 10,000 kilometers of transmission in a very short time. And of course, because there's no vertical integration, there would be a misalignment between generation, transmission, and distribution development. And then a little bit about hydrogen, which is an exciting thing for Australia, because there's a lot of sun and there's water, countries surrounded by water, which would be great as soon as salt water electrolysis is sorted. What do we do with this hydrogen? This is a whole seminar on its own, really, but where we currently see the use for hydrogen is starting with the usages that there are already in the market, making that hydrogen use green, so that hydrogen being produced by renewable energy. Then we also see a huge application for it in heavy haulage transport, Reason for that is you can install a battery in a car because the battery doesn't need to be too big to drive that car, but you can't do it in a truck because the battery would be too heavy. So you need to fuel it with something else. So your energy store, instead of burning fuel or fossil fuel, you simply use hydrogen, which is a lot cleaner, seeing that it was made by renewable energy. And then, of course, the whole point of blue hydrogen is a transition fuel, blue hydrogen being something that can be made from fossil fuel. There's a lot of people around the world looking into that, and then just capturing your carbon offsets. So carbon capture storage, and then using that carbon for other purposes. There's, of course, a big market for carbon around the world as well. Australia actually has a carbon shortage at this moment. So there's benefits in that as well. Matt, do you want to add something on hydrogen? Matt's very passionate about hydrogen. And
I would
set up a lot
only
of things in Australia to get that going.
I would only second your comments. There's an enormous opportunity in Australia for hydrogen, I think, globally. The green hydrogen, the cracking of water is an enormous opportunity because of the renewable energy resources we have in Australia, and the parallels can be drawn with South Africa. Blue hydrogen is actually a reaction to, primarily by coal mine owners who do not have a market for their coal anymore, and they need to work out what they're going to do with it. So they are gasifying it, turning it into hydrogen, and that is a very, very interesting ideal. Australia has made and has a very large LNG industry, and the parallels with LNG for liquid hydrogen or ammonia are huge. The other thing I would note in closing is Australia has the deepest penetration of rooftop solar in the world. In Queensland, where I am today, 1 in 3 houses has rooftop solar and is effectively off-grid with a battery. That's an enormous amount of rooftop solar. It is the single largest generator in the market by megawatt hour, if you count the behind-the-meter consumption. That is a huge challenge for the market system and a huge challenge for the market operator to manage that solar, but it also presents a huge opportunity. It is probably if I want to leave you on something, the Australian market is a two-way street. It is a two-way distribution system where rooftop generation, the prosumer, is dominant and will continue to be dominant. And we are seeing regulations be implemented over the next 12 months to facilitate that in terms of virtual power plants and the controlling of those systems. So in conclusion, and I'm very happy to take questions at the end of today's session. In conclusion, there are enormous parallels between where Australia is today and the challenges that South Africa faces today. There are opportunities to learn from our mistakes, but there are also enormous opportunities to leapfrog I wouldn't call them mistakes in the Australian market, in the Australian context, but leapfrog the things that we had to do because technology was not there. The opportunity to build large wind, large solar, and energy storage systems to leapfrog the challenges we've had with gas in this market in particular, and to address the tidal wave of rooftop solar that will come. Thank you very much for making time.
Thank you very much, Matt and Adriaan. Some food for thought for the minds regarding dirty fossil fuels, to make a plan with it around hydrogen. Interesting one. Your thoughts on solar as a challenge for the market, also a very, very interesting one. As you correctly say, we can go on for many hours more.